Okay, I am delighted to be joined by New York Times best-selling author Larry Olmsted, who's got a new book out. It's called Fans: How Watching Sports Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Understanding. I'm delighted to welcome Larry to the show right now. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Larry, this is absolutely fantastic news because all we have done for the second half of this pandemic is sit at home and watch game after game after game on our TV. So you are telling us that this has been a really good decision.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's probably even a better decision in the pandemic. Everybody needs a little mental health, a little bit of stress relief, a little bit of happiness and diversion. A lot of the psychologists I talked to told me about how sports has traditionally been a source of diversion during, times of unrest, whether it's war or after, natural disasters. And this is sort of a unique one in that it affects everyone in the world.
That's a really interesting point. But if we get into the science, because this is a book based on science, it's not just randomized theory thrown out here. How does sport benefit us?
Well, probably the biggest thing at the personal level would fall under community. The psychologists have about 24 different mental health benefits attributed to being a sports fan. Things like lower rates of depression, higher self-esteem, larger social circles, and better connectivity to others. But I think most of those all come from this one underlying factor of community, which, the sense of belonging to a group, particularly a group of fans. I don't know if you guys use the term over there, but we've taken in the States to using whatever the name of the team is, fill in the blank nation, right? Red Sox nation, Yankees nation, in a way that you don't do for, say, Harry Potter or Star Wars fans, right? Sports is unique in a lot of ways because of that. And one of the big things is when you watch a game, pretty much whatever, whether it's your football or our football, you see tens of thousands of people in the stands, a lot of them wearing jerseys or colors or hats. And even though you think you're watching a sporting event, not a bunch of spectators, you can't help but see them. So even when you're home on your couch, you get this feeling that you're part of something bigger than yourself, which again, you don't get when you watch. I love Star Wars, but if I watch it on TV, I don't feel like I'm belonging to anything. And you see people in the supermarket, with a hat for your, rugby team or whatever it is. And there's this shared recognition. Bumper stickers is something in this country. People put a lot of sports team bumper stickers on their cars, and you drive around and you can't help but, if you're in New York, you're going to see Yankees logos. So again, in a way that other kinds of fandom don't really have. So there's this constant sense of community, and that belonging makes us happy.
Why is that? Why does that sense of belonging make us happy? And why is it something that we chase so desperately?
It's DNA. I mean, humans are innately tribal creatures, and going back, to the Stone Ages, people lived together in groups. And up until the Industrial Revolution, extended families, typically anywhere in the world, lived together under one roof. And people have always banded together to form villages, city-states, towns, nations. When we get the odd person who actually enjoys living alone in a cabin in the woods cut off from society, that's when we get what we call the Unabomber, in this country. So most people, it's human nature to crave a sense of tribal belonging, and sports fandom provides that in a way very, very few other things do. The only, thing really on a scale globally with it would be religion.
Sport has probably overtaken that in many elements of society at this point.
It has, because, when they poll people and they say, are you a sports fan? If you say yes, that pretty much is a guarantee you watch some sports. If they ask you if you're religious, it's certainly not a guarantee that you go to church or synagogue or the mosque, right? It just means, that you affiliate. And certainly, sports fans collectively are bigger, or more people that belong to any single organized religion in the world.
And that's an interesting point that you make there about people who say that they are sports fans, invariably watching sport, because I wonder if it's actually a cool thing to be a sports fan. I don't know. I've been a sports fan my entire life, so it's never really been a decision for me to get into sport. But you point to the fact that sports fans, when depicted in popular culture, for example, it's not a very flattering depiction that they tend to be labeled with, particularly in United States film and television. Is it a cool thing, I guess, from the outside looking in, from the standpoint of a non-sports fan, to be a sports fan?
It is not cool, and that is one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because I think people should take pride in being a sports fan, and it's not that people who are sports fans are embarrassed of it, but it's typically not what they put out there as their image, or the first thing, the way that they identify themselves. It's just something they are. And yeah, when I did a pretty deep dive, I looked at, every sitcom and every Hollywood movie that focused on sports fans, and the stereotype is almost universally negative. The person is always obese and always male. I mean, about almost half of sports fans are women, always drinking too much, and it gets worse from there. That's the good depiction of the sports fan. The bad one is psychotic. So I think and when I do talk to non-sports fans, a lot of them say, "Oh, it just seems like a waste of time watching, sports." But they don't say that if you say, "I was reading," or "I was listening to music," or "I was, building model train sets." Whatever your hobby is, people who don't belong to it don't seem to perceive it as a waste of time in the way they often do with sports.
Because it's interesting. The book every chapter starts with a continuation of your dialogue with a person who's not so much a sports fan as you are. Why do you think people from that standpoint see sports as a waste of time?
I think because they don't do it themselves, and it can be. I mean, there's certainly in every group, there's people at the extremes, and there's certainly extreme sports fans who spend probably too much time watching sports and too much money on it, and that's one of the reasons why I don't consider myself a particularly avid sports fan, because I really I watch NFL football, I watch some baseball, but what I consider the hardcore sports fans I know watch everything, and in this country too, college sports are really big, which I know they're not in Europe, but it's almost like a whole second set of professional leagues, right? Second football, second basketball. So people have, this is the one time of year in the country when things are a little bit slow in sports. The Super Bowl just went by. Baseball hasn't started. The Masters isn't on. But other than maybe mid-March, March Madness is coming, what we call that, the NCAA basketball tournament. Other than that, it's around the clock available all the time. And so I can see why people think of a sports fan as someone hunkered down in front of their TV, but that's not really true. And I got to say, when I said before that people who describe themselves as sports fans watch sports, often so do people who don't describe themselves as sports fans, which is the perfect example of Dr. Christie in the book, who's a real person, a friend of mine. As soon as she got talking about the Chicago Bulls, she remembered that she watched sports.
Yeah, nostalgia can be a powerful tool when you throw it into the sports mix to sort of, hold on a minute, I actually do remember a certain moment in time as a result of sport being a thing that exists. From her perspective, and from the perspective of people who perhaps aren't tribal when it comes to a team currently participating in sport, is there an acceptance sometimes that activity can be separated from sport, where somebody can appreciate that being active and participating in sport is positive for you, but they will also disassociate that from actually sitting down and watching a game on television?
Absolutely. And I think probably the biggest example of that would be something like the Olympics, where a lot of people who maybe don't watch sports at other times tune in, and you have, the non-team sports. I think when most of us think about watching sports on TV, we're thinking about the major professional leagues, but there's also, in individual sports, there's obviously golf and tennis would be at the top of that probably, but, track and field, swimming, things like that are, not team sports. And in the Olympics, I think that the reason why a lot of non-fans tune in is because of the athleticism, and they appreciate that fitness and drive and training and desire that it goes into being the fastest man in the world or the fastest woman in the world. And that's one of the reasons why every Olympics, and it used to be every 4 years, but recently it's every 2 years, there's a rush afterwards to sign up for gym memberships and health clubs and get into shape. And that's people who are inspired by those examples they see on TV. And that's when I think, sports can have a transformative effect when you take a spectator who's otherwise sedentary and encourage them to suddenly become active. That's very good for them and for society.
And then the other way in which sport can go in terms of its really positive benefits is, I guess, the healing power of sport. And 9/11 is something that you cover in great detail in the book, and how New York at that time, how the United States at that time look towards whatever the first round of the MLB coming back, the first night of the NBA coming back, as this really, truly unifying moment in the weeks that had just preceded that moment. Could you talk us through that a little bit, and how that was very much real rather than this idea of positivity that perhaps we might invent?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a long history. I mean, I talked to someone from the State Department who said, going back to ancient Greece, they would use the Olympics to end the ongoing cycle of violence and bring a period of peace, because you weren't allowed to have city-state wars during the Olympics. And it's always been this sort of historic calming effect. And after Pearl Harbor was bombed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, urged Major League Baseball not to cancel, because he knew that the people needed a diversion to keep them from feeling terrified of being, at the first time we'd been attacked on our own, territory. And this comes up again and again, man-made and natural disasters. But 9/11 was especially high profile, because 9/11 itself was so high profile in our country. But though the first game in New York, a Mets game after baseball resumed after about a week-long break, everyone I know in New York, whether they're a baseball fan or not, vividly remembers that game. And one of the fans I interviewed who was there said, that was the moment when it was okay to smile and laugh again. And that's pretty powerful stuff. And then that, just a few weeks later, the Yankees played in the World Series and hosted that also in New York, and President Bush threw out the first pitch. And, both of those games are immediately on the highlight reels of iconic baseball moments. And, but people all over the country tuned in, and people all over the country, with the exception, they were playing the Braves. So with the exception of Atlanta Braves fans, everyone pretty much in the country was rooting for New York to win, just because they needed the bounce back. And it's happened again and again since then. It happened with the Boston Marathon bombing. The Red Sox and sports really played a role in healing the city. And then we had this 1 October, which is the Las Vegas concert shooting, which is the largest mass shooting in American history. And I went out there after that and interviewed people who had been literally shot, and also shot at and terrified. And right after that was when the city's first major professional sports team, Las Vegas is the largest city in the United States that didn't have a basketball, baseball, football, or hockey team. And they had just gotten their first hockey team, and the season started about 10 days after that shooting. And it had such an amazing healing effect on people. I talked to a woman who was afraid to go out of her house and finally went to a hockey game, and it basically, changed her life. So it's hard when you talk to people like that and they tell you about being shot and then being saved spiritually and emotionally by hockey. It's hard to discount it and say, oh, it's just sport.
And I guess if you look at what's going on in the world right now, it's a little bit less linear, because there have been moments in the United States and here as well in Europe where there have been moments where fans have got back into stadiums. There have been more normal moments at times in the last 12 months than now feels normal, I guess, in certain places. Do you think that'll still happen, though, at the end of this, when people are vaccinated, when you have your first capacity stadium in the United States, for example, that people will say, right, it is okay to feel happy again, and sport will be the vehicle through which they feel that?
I absolutely feel that way, because when even now, at least, the games in this country that have had sports, it's very limited. Sometimes, 1/6, 1/8, 1/10 capacity. They just had the first Dallas NBA game with any fans had 1,100 people in an arena that, seats 30,000 people. But when you can go and sit shoulder to shoulder among 50,000 people with strangers and high five them in between plays without wearing masks, hopefully someday, that is really when you'll know that normalcy has returned to society.
For sure. It's something that we're all looking forward to say the least. Just a couple of other things I just wanted to ask you about, Larry, just to kind of come full circle on the idea of tribalism, and that is essentially where fandom comes from. The shared emotion that you have in a stadium, that has now been transported into an online space, it seems, predominantly. With that, are you seeing more toxicity when it comes to tribal fan groups, and it's not just tribal fan groups full stop, when it comes to them battening down the hatches, standing by their team, through good or through bad, supporting whatever characters may be on their team. And I guess then the poison that comes from them to opposition teams and fans at times.
Yes and no. It's really a double-edged sword here, because the rollout and prevalence of sports radio and online chat has made it much easier for people to express their toxic feelings and just make it easier to either be heard or feel like they're being heard. And certainly, we have second guessing team decisions, managerial decisions, particular plays is a big thing. As your team loses, people go on and on about what the coach should have done or did wrong, and that becomes a back and forth banter that makes builds anger, but also keeps sports radio in business. But on the other side, the big game changer in the last few years has been the advent of fantasy sports, and it has grown very, very quickly. I don't know the stats for Europe. I know you do. You participate and you have it for soccer, but just in North America, just in the U.S. and Canada, about 60 million people currently regularly play fantasy sports, and that's a lot. It's about a third of all sports fans. And when you do that, you can no longer really maintain your tribal nature and be successful. You have to draft players from the other hated teams. So once you do that, it's hard to hate the player that you're rooting for to make your fantasy team win. And there have already been studies of this really softening that us versus them, and where I live in New England, which is Red Sox country. So it's very normal for people to say, oh, I hate the Yankees, I hate Yankee fans. But that's no longer the case when you have 2 or 3 members of the Yankees on your fantasy baseball team. And I talked, especially football fans, the rivalries in American football. I talked to a really avid fantasy sports player who's in several different leagues, and he was a Redskins fan. And he told me for years he couldn't draft anyone from the Dallas Cowboys because they're, the opponent, but he kept losing. So finally he asked you, and the NFL rolled out a thing here called the Red Zone channel, which is basically a special TV channel just for following fantasy sports plays. And it's incredibly popular. So that's the big, and I interviewed a lot of people who told me about their entire families sort of losing their traditional rivalry hatreds between certain teams because of fantasy sports. So I think that's a good thing.
That's really interesting, because I play both fantasy sports in the United States and our fantasy Premier League here, for example. And it does seem that the US versions are always far more advanced. And I think it's just because the US got a bit of a head start. So as somebody who might have seen fantasy sports grow and grow, did you feel that the more information that was at the hands of the fantasy managers, so to speak, or the fantasy coaches, that it became more of an important thing in their lives, where they had more data, a more advanced game to be playing, for example, that their love of it and their attachment to it just increased as well?
Absolutely. And there's several other benefits I've seen from fantasy sports. I mean, one of it is the sort of the educational component, right? If you're to follow the statistics and follow the players and stay on top of it is a real mental engagement, like doing a crossword puzzle or something. I think it's good for our brains, but also the connectivity, the community I talked about. I know a lot of people who play in multiple fantasy sports leagues based on their affiliation. So they'll have one where they play all with people they went to college or university with, one where they play with, former coworkers from their last job, whatever it is. And especially now in the pandemic, this is an extension of social media, a way for people to stay connected, where in the old days they would have had to pick up the phone and call all these people. So it definitely has another layer of belonging and engagement. And then finally, there's a big family / multi-generational component. I know a lot of people who maybe co-manage their fantasy team with their 12-year-old son or daughter. And in a way, I see fantasy sports as replacing things like Monopoly or Scrabble around the kitchen table. They're drafting, they're reading the paper, they're discussing it, they bust out the laptop, and I think it's a good way for families to engage.
And the thing is, a 12-year-old kid is probably beating their mom or dad at this point when it comes to fantasy sports. I like that. I like that note to leave it on, Larry. You're basically telling us that if you support a team and one of your fantasy Premier League players is playing against your team, it is totally okay and scientifically proven to root a little bit against your team for the benefit of your own fantasy football team. That's a positive note to leave it on.
Well, thank you. And yeah, I think anything that, makes us kinder, gentler sports fans is good.
For sure. I should mention as well, sportsfansbook.com is where you can check out more about this book. It's called Fans, How Watching Sports Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Understanding. We have barely scratched the tip of the iceberg here, so go check it out for more on it. Larry Olmsted, who I understand is a Ballyliffin golf course regular as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.